Bryan Lunduke and I have a little friendly competition going for who can come up with, the most absurd thing to put Linux on. Bryan Lunduke is sort of well known in the Linux community. He's the author of the Linux Sucks presentation, author, article writer, OpenSUSE board member. A lot of fun stuff, really amazing guy. So this is what I've put Linux on. This is a Hayes 1200 baud modem that was originally manufactured in 1984. Yes, I put Linux on that. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Modems like this used to connect to other computers. Like, this is what you would use to talk to other computers, basically. And modems work by making horrible screeching noises on phone lines to other computers that are connected to those phone lines. And so if you wanted to talk to a particular computer, you would dial that computer's phone number, and this modem would make horrible screeching noises to the other modem, and you would have a data communication. You could exchange programs and that sort of thing. It's sort of a Rube Goldberg communications device. And if it weren't for companies and sort of the proliferation of modems in the beginning, we really wouldn't have had internet access as we know it, because it's not internet access that drove the adoption of modems. It was something else entirely. So, not just putting Linux on a modem, but I want to sort of share that nostalgia, that experience with you guys. And in order to do that, we're going to need to go back in time. So I've literally turned this modem into a time machine of sorts. We're going to go back in time and experience BBSs, or bulletin board systems. When they said, sing me the song of your people, this is what they had in mind with modems. Ah, yes. Wait for it. Wait for it. Yes, that's the sound of a successful data connection. Not just that, even the DTMF tones, it sort of evokes a feeling of nostalgia. Now, there's some of you in the audience that have no idea. You didn't have to experience the pains of even dial-up internet or connecting to the internet through a modem. But that was some of the most exciting noises of my childhood. Definitely, I had a very exciting childhood. But just to be clear, 1984 was a time well before Linux, well before really the ubiquity of computing, well before even people were saying, I need a computer at home. There were a lot of people at that time that just didn't think that a home computer was anything that was relevant or that mattered. So this is really a before time, and this was also really a much more personal time. So when you connected to a BBS, you were very often connecting to a group of super nerdy people, not just, faceless anonymous people on the internet that I think is what we experience today. So in addition to being a time machine, it's not really super useful if the only thing it does is a time machine, right? And so the other really surprising thing that you can put Linux on is the desktop, because hey, it's the year of the Linux desktop, right? Linux is going to take over the universe. Yeah, this is a full-fledged Linux desktop. It's got the ASRock B-Box on the inside. You can see we've got two HDMI DisplayPort, USB 3, gigabit Ethernet. The B-Box supports up to 16 gigabytes of RAM, tons of connectivity. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. But yeah, there's a full desktop Linux workstation in there as well, in sort of this half of the modem internally. But this half of the modem, you can see I've got my flux capacitor there for the time circuits. But the other half is really sort of emulating a function of a modem, or providing that sort of nostalgia and connectivity to the past, to BBSs. And for those of you that might say that all I did was just take the case of a fabulous all aluminum modem from 1984 and stuff a Linux box in there, well, I've got to tell you about a ship that belonged to a guy named Theseus. But that's a story for another time. Now, my other idea was a waffle iron, a really nice, top of the line, cast iron and chrome waffle iron. And, really that choice has its, history rooted in BBSs as well. That was something from the bastard operator from hell. And he was always electrocuting interns with the Model 3. And so I really wanted to build a Model 3 and internet enable it and sort of build that as an homage. And then I realized it's like, well, the nostalgia of that, putting Linux on a waffle iron, is really, I can go for the superset of that, which is to put Linux on a 1200 baud modem from 1984. Now, the other interesting thing here is this modem is so old, 1984, it was probably never used to get on the internet. Not just because it's so old, but also because it's so slow. It's 1200 baud. 1200 baud is like, I can't even explain to you really how slow that is. It's 1200 bits per second, but you know, that's just a number. How can I put it in a context that you can understand? Well, from the day this modem was manufactured until today, if it was on and operating continuously, it would have only managed to transfer a grand lifetime total of about 156 gigabytes. I've got more than 200 gigabytes in here now in solid state storage, in something smaller than a postage stamp inside the modem, which also contains archives of all of these BBSs from history that preservationists were able to save. BBSs were some of the first information hubs. Some of them were really fancy and could dial out other BBSs and download messages, and it was sort of the precursor to an electronic mail system. Like some BBSs could actually dial other BBSs and relay mail between users and that kind of thing. Now, of course, it was not really secure or encrypted or anything like that. Nobody was really thinking about those things. But for the time period that we're talking about, the 1980s and 1990s, there were a lot more computers than just PC or Mac. There were a lot more formats. There were a lot more kinds of disks. You had 5 1/4 inch disks, 3 1/2 inch disks. If I had a program written in BASIC on my IBM XT, and you had a Commodore 64, and you wanted my BASIC program from me, honestly, the easiest way for us to exchange it was via modem or via BBS. So, you know, over time, BBSs became a software distribution platform, but people really spent a lot of time there, and you know, graphics weren't really even a part of like the user interface. Or you know, you would log into a BBS, and instead of a web page where you've got all kinds of graphics and, you know, it's fancy and cool looking and every web page looks different, you know, BBSs are really designed to work in like 80 by 24 text. And what graphics there were was just people making art with, you know, the ASCII character set, and later with colors in the ASCII character set, and that became ANSI art. And so there's this really wonderful BBS documentary online that you should totally check out. And I'm hoping to do some content with Jason Scott. He's sort of the proprietor of textfiles.com, which archives some of this information and is where I sort of drew some of the information that I've put into our modem time machine in order to go back in time, sort of, and be able to sort of experience BBSs as they were. So in short, the BBS days, it was a magical experience, and really that magic is what I want to share with you. I mean, since I could pick up a screwdriver, I was dialing into a BBS. A BBS is where I learned to read and argue and you know, sort of a trial by fire with trolling and all that sorts of things. So you're sitting there saying, yeah, you put a Linux box in an aluminum housing, big deal. I mean, anybody can do that. You know, just take a computer, stuff it in a new box, call it a day. No, that's not the cool thing about this project. The cool thing about this project is that it still kind of is a modem. There is actually a second Linux machine. There's 2 Linux machines in here. So did I get bonus points for that or something in this little competition? Yeah, there's a second Linux machine in here that is basically pretending to be a modem. And that second Linux machine is the thing that has copies of all of the information from archive.org and from Jason Scott's website and from other resources that I've sort of gathered across the internet. And in that is an archive of all of the information that I could find about tons and tons of different BBSs. The Linux machine pretends to be a modem and will accept, you know, AT commands, and when you dial a phone number with this modem, instead of, you know, hitting the phone line and dialing the phone number, it uses the phone number to look up information about that BBS in the database. So the ASCII or ANSI artwork associated with that BBS, even things down to like the noises that the modem makes, is consistent with whatever information we have about that BBS from the database. So if somebody had, you know, Courier VFast 19200 modems, you will hear a Courier VFast 19200 connect sound. Well, actually, 1 in 8 times it will fail to connect, and you will get an appropriate fail to connect sound. And tracking down the sounds was really hard. I actually had to hook up a couple of modems from my own collection in order to get some of those sounds. And the device that's responsible for that is a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's playing through a PWM circuit with an amplifier through an internal speaker right in the modem itself. But enough about that. Let me do an actual demonstration. Let's fire up the flux capacitor, actually issue an ATDT command, and call the Nuclear Meltdown BBS. Now, Nuclear Meltdown was sort of a lot of fun, full of a lot of youthful indiscretions, I should say. You know, DOS demos, that kind of thing. A lot of, probably my first experience with 8-bit music. A lot of fun stuff. But The games, really, I want to show you the games while we're at this. I mean, I can't not mention the games. The big ones, Trade Wars 2002, Usurper, and Legend of the Red Dragon. These games, even though they're sort of a text mode interface, and you can learn more about them in the BBS documentary, but even though it's text mode, they're really rich, fun adventures. And because there are multiple people playing them, there's still people playing them today. That should tell you how interesting and engaging these games are. So you can experience those for yourself. You can download them. There are DOS versions of the executables. You can play those just fine. But I've got them hooked up through the BBS software on our modem time machine. And so you can experience Usurper, Legend of the Red Dragon, whatever, directly on the modem, directly as a local experience, whatever you might want to do. And so all of that is running from a Raspberry Pi Zero. Well, why a Raspberry Pi Zero? Wait, how does this work internally? Okay, so in the modem, controlling the LEDs and the speaker is a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's in gadget mode. To set up gadget mode is really easy. You just have to enable a couple overlays. There's not really a big deal to that. There are links in the description for the specific step-by-step how-tos that I use to do that. But a Raspberry Pi Zero can pretend to be a USB network device, a modem, serial device I should say, a keyboard, whatever. And so I use the Raspberry Pi Zero gadget mode for serial to pretend to be a modem. And then on Linux, normally you use something like Getty, G-E-T-T-Y, and it will run a login program on the serial port, so that when you connect to serial port, you get a login password prompt, just as if you were connecting through SSH or whatever, or on the console of your Linux machine. Well, instead of running a Getty, I can run a Python program that pretends to be a modem and will do the lookups in the MySQL database and that sort of thing. So plugging in the Raspberry Pi through USB, Universal Serial Bus, it's still using the RS-232 protocol. Now, in order to do that, yes, I needed to do some soldering. I needed to set up some LEDs for the front panel and use some tiny surface mount pull-down resistors or pull-up resistors. Current limiting resistors really is what they function as. And I had to tie those into the GPIO pins of the Raspberry Pi. And so those pins are explicitly controlled by my Python program. Same with the sound. The sound is implemented with a PWM overlay. And it's just mono, so I'm only using one PWM channel to control the speaker. But you can basically just use some resistors and capacitors to smooth out that PWM channel, pass it through an amplifier, and then feed it into an 8-ohm speaker internally in the modem, and you're good to go. This thing can play sound effects. So it still kind of is a modem. I mean, it's a little bit like a photograph of the past, as opposed to, like really being in the past and experiencing the past. But it is enough of an experience that you can get the feel for loading information through a serial port, through the limitations of a serial port, connecting at some different speeds. There's a Linux I/O control for setting the serial speeds, and so you can sort of throttle the connections through that serial port. But the Raspberry Pi Zero also supports other modes of connections in the USB gadget, like networking. If you're going to do this, you really should just use the networking gadget, because honestly that's better than serial anyway. But because I wanted an homage to the past, I used the actual serial connection. In terms of the workstation, the Linux workstation is based on the ASRock B-Box. The ASRock B-Box supports up to 16 gigabytes of memory. I could connect a 4 terabyte 2.5-inch drive to this if I really wanted to. I've got a 128 gig flash drive in there right now, PCI Express, mini PCI Express flash drive. But that's what provides the 2 HDMI and DisplayPort connections at the back. I guarantee you this is probably the only Hayes Smarmodem 1200 in the world that supports a 4K 30 Hertz display output. So you're using a Raspberry Pi Zero, and it's like, wait a minute, you were just showing us Legend of the Red Dragon. How does that work? Well, Legend of the Red Dragon is written for x86. The CPU on a Raspberry Pi is an ARM CPU, and the smartasses in the audience are saying, oh, you just DOSBox. Yeah, Raspberry Pi's got a DOSBox. The problem with DOSBox is that DOSBox wants to take over the graphical port on the Raspberry Pi. It really only works with HDMI. We don't have an HDMI connection. We have serial. It's a serial connection from the Raspberry Pi Zero to the ASRock B-Box. So what do you do? 8086 Tiny. 8086 Tiny is an 8086 emulator that it's just text. It just passes text back. It has no graphical capabilities whatsoever. Literally all you get is just text. And so with 8086 Tiny, I was able to track down from archive.org copies of Legend of the Red Dragon and Trade Wars, although I think I had to dig around a little bit more to find a copy of Usurper. So one thing I wanted to shoehorn into this video, and I couldn't figure out a way to do it eloquently, so we're just going to do it, is Amiga Trek. Like, I don't remember anything about anything, but before MP3s were a thing, Amiga or Amiga, depending on how you want to pronounce it, had this really amazing audio file format called a mod, and you could combine samples and some other stuff, and the most amazing mod ever created, not really, but the only one that I can remember, was Amiga Trek. And so I can connect to my fake BBS, and I can send via Z modem or X modem, which were like the modem file transfer protocols that BBSs would use, an Amiga Trek mod, and enjoy Amiga Trek all over again. Now you might have noticed that some of the parts for the modem were actually 3D printed. The back I/O shield and also the LED holder, as well as the USB port thing for the top, those were all 3D printed, and I just put those together at tinkercad.com. Honestly, that's what I've used 3D printing for more than anything. By the way, if you're on Linux and you're wanting to enjoy some of the ASCII art and you're just getting question marks and stuff like that for the character sets, you're going to want to set the IBM 855 acrylic character set, because it's got the extended ASCII characters, most of them. It's mostly correct. It's not 100% correct, but it's mostly correct. And that's what I used for the terminal screen capture for this, where I'm in a graphical mode in GNOME, just so you know. The way I see it is, if you're going to turn a modem into a nostalgia-fueled time machine, you might as well do it with some style. Besides, the aluminum construction was really the perfect thing for the passive heatsink of the ASRock B-Box. I've got a thermal pad connecting the ASRock B-Box heatsink to the external aluminum chassis of the modem, and that means I've got a fanless PC, completely quiet, completely silent. And the actual software that we're using for the BBS part of it is called Mystic BBS. Now, my Python program should be capable of taking the information that's in the database and rewriting some of the menu files that the Mystic BBS uses, so that when you connect to a BBS, it's really just the same instance of Mystic BBS, but it's switching out information from the database. Now, this is both much more convoluted and dramatically way more impractical than just having a web page where you can search for information about the BBSs or browse through it or browse through archive.org. So if you want to see this, you don't have to go through all the hell of doing that to just experience some of this old BBS stuff. You really, honestly, you don't have to do any of that. You can just go to archive.org right now and run through this. But the way that I experienced it was through dial-up, and the way that I experienced it was by connecting to a whole bunch of different computers, connecting with other people in the community, and certainly BBSs worldwide received a lot of love and attention from many people that are still there. I mean, it seems like ancient history, but a lot of the people that did this are still alive. And if this is something that you want to learn more about, you should check out the BBS documentary. I'm honestly looking forward to having a chat with Jason Scott, because I've sort of followed his work for years, and he's a tremendously funny guy. He's presented at DEF CON. If nothing else, you should really check out the presentation that he did, which was I think the title of it was something along the lines of "That One Time I Got Sued for $2 billion," because he's running an archive thing and there are crazy people in the world. But it was a fun time. It was a simpler time, and it's really. I try not to be nostalgic and I try not to be attached to the past, but I really had a blast in those days, and I knew some really interesting characters, and I really had a lot of fun. And so hopefully that's cool enough to challenge Bryan Lunduke's Linux-powered talking puppet. I don't know that it is. I don't know that it's quite as cool as a Linux-powered talking puppet, but maybe the 2-for-1 Linux box, or maybe the flux capacitor. I don't know. I had fun with the project, and I think that you guys, hopefully, if you've watched it this long, you probably enjoyed the video. I'm Wendell. I'll see you on the forums, and I'm signing out. Oh, I should also point out that the details for the contest are below, and so if you want to vote for me for the contest, there's a link to the poll in the description, and you should totally go and vote for the amazing aluminum modem time machine, even though the puppet is really cool too.